Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Dustin Bird, Professor of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Olivet. I'm also the founder and co-director of the Institute for Critical Social Theory, as well as the editor-in-chief of Ekporosis Press. And today, we're going to be talking about the origins and struggle between the authoritarian and democratic character in movements today. When Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history and the last man at the close of the Cold War, he did not foresee that the neoliberal hegemony of capitalism, accompanied by its weaker cousin democracy, would engender a backlash in much of the world. Nor did he foresee that such a hegemonic condition would create deep-seated tensions within the West itself. The triumph of the West over the rest, which was to bring about liberal emancipation for those ensnared in authoritarian ideologies and theologies, gave way to a clash of civilizations, at least in Samuel Huntington's perspective, wherein the secular liberal West would struggle against resurgent religiosity and theocracy, most poignantly emanating from the Muslim world. The binaries of us versus them, the enlightened moderns versus the barbarian pre-moderns, proved to be overly simplistic as it failed to closely examine the inner antagonisms of the West itself, especially the struggle between the authoritarian and democratic character types. These two competing personality types, rooted in both nature and Bildung, have come to the foreground of political and cultural struggles in recent years, expressing themselves within the contradictory visions for the future of the West and the world. Does the West continue to open itself to the others, emphasizing inclusivity, multiculturalism, anti-racism, rooted in the Enlightenment's notion of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the secularization of core religious ideals, values, and principles? Or does it close itself off from the others, emphasizing nativistic identity, homogeneity, and the remarriage of ethnos and demos? Where the democratic personality sees freedom in openness, dynamism, and spontaneity, the global community, the authoritarian sees freedom in order, predictability, and stasis, the Volksgemeinschaft, if you will. Where the democratic personality tends to see beyond the horizon, the authoritarian cares little for what's beyond, taking refuge in the familiar, the comfortable, the idealized past. In an age of social disintegration, wherein the norms of civilization are not only questioned, but are vigorously undermined for the utopia beyond, one finds the growth of existential meaninglessness, social chaos, and extreme anxiety, the universal neuroticization of society. In societies that are untethered, from their traditional moorings, the authoritarian demagogue finds their followers. Those who are willing to abandon the reality that causes so much existential pain and identity confusion, and who adopt simplistic and binary worldviews conveniently provided to them by self-serving authoritarians. The struggle for democracy and the rise of authoritarian politics throughout the West has demonstrated that the end of history was wildly optimistic. The culture camp, the wars of cultures continue. And as Russia's attack on Ukraine, Israel's attack on Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran, Trump's attack on 8 countries in 1 year, including Iran, as well as Israel's ongoing genocide of Gazans, let alone the impoverishment of the global South and the precariat of the global North, demonstrates that the slaughter bench of history, as Hegel calls it, proceeds unimpressed with Fukuyama's ill-fated diagnosis. Much like Marx's claim about the ubiquity of the class struggle, it appears there will always be a struggle between the authoritarian personality and the democratic personality. But does there have to be? Today we have joining us Dr. Rudolf J. Siebert, Professor Emeritus of Religion and Society at Western Michigan University, a member of the Institute for Critical Social Theory. Dr. Siebert has authored over 30 books and well over 100 articles and book chapters. Recently, he published the book Hegel and the Critical Theory of Religion with Ekperosis Press. His latest article on the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm was recently published in the inaugural edition of the journal Critical Perspectives, the journal of the Institute for Critical Social Theory. Over the course of 60 plus years, Dr. Siebert has developed the critical theory of religion and society, or what is called dialectical religiology. For more information on Dr. Siebert, see the website dedicated to his work, dialectical-religion.org, and check out the 100 plus videos on the Rudolf J. Siebert Audio Visual Archive on YouTube. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Siebert.
You're welcome.
So, is there anything that you would like to include there in my opening monologue there about the democratic and authoritarian personalities that I missed?
No, I think you said it all. I think, of course, the history of these antagonists, the democratic personality and the authoritarian one, goes back to the Axis time. It goes back to the beginning of our civilization. So it has been with us, and it is now with us right now in this moment of history. We have this struggle again in our own country. So you summed it all up.
Good. So, can you give us a brief understanding of what the authoritarian personality and the democratic personality is?
Well, the whole thing comes from Erich Fromm, who, in the before Hitler's rise to power, he interviewed a few thousand people really about these two character types. That on one side we have this authoritarian personality, and on the other side we have the revolutionary personality. And what the percentage is, maybe 10% on one side and 10% on the other, then one could foresee what would come. And so, in this sense, foresaw the rise of Hitler and National Socialism and so on. So that goes back, the whole language about authoritarian and so on goes back there. So what is the authoritarian personality? It is romantic. That means it is backward oriented to the good old times. We want to become great again. Again, that means as it was once. So that is the authoritarian issue. So and then on the other side we have the revolutionary character. So the authoritarian character, besides this romantic element, there are other characteristics which we can get to as we continue our discourse.
So, like you mentioned Erich Fromm and the psychoanalyst and early member of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. And he devised the F scale, right? And that was a means of determining where someone's social characteristics or social personality would fall between a revolutionary character, or what later on we call the democratic character, and the other one was the fascist side, correct? And what were you explained to us? What were the results of this type of testing on people?
Well, it made it possible somehow to understand history and even make predictions. So, of course, the revolutionary character from when he came to Chicago then changed it into the democratic character because we are such a conservative country and revolutionary did not sound very well. So, therefore, from then on, it was called the democratic character on one side and the revolutionary and the authoritarian character on the other side. And what we have here now, and they predicted it, Adorno predicted all what happens now in the 60s. We have the rise of the authoritarian personality in our own society. Trumpism.
Trumpism, yeah, as a form of authoritarian leadership that appeals to the authoritarian personality and
Yeah.
working class, especially, or at middle class, as it was in Nazi Germany, a strong attraction to the authoritarian and among the middle class, especially the upper middle class. Yes.
Yeah, it is particularly the shopkeepers left over from the Middle Ages. It's they are the basis for this fascist rise in every society. So yes, so the authoritarian personality has this romantic element, but it has also, as I said, other things which we will discuss later.
Mhm. Yeah, especially that romanticism, the backward looking, this longing for a palingenesis, a rebirth, which is summed up as you're talking about in the Trumpism with "Make America Great Again." So it's this almost like perverse, backward looking, forward movement, where you try to reproduce the past.
Yeah, then in Europe too, there also this to be Europe great again. Europe, according to Spengler, was going down, was coming to the end. No, the fascists said we will give birth again to it, and so they called the Project Barbarossa, for instance. That was the attack against the Soviet Union. Barbarossa was a great king, the greatest one in the Middle Ages. So it was this return to the beginning again. So that Spengler was not right. Europe was not at the end. Europe could have a new beginning. So that was the hope of this fascist movement.
Yeah, and if the authoritarian personality as well as the revolutionary democratic personality is a matter of psychology, then it also has to be a matter of society as well, since these personalities don't just spontaneously come about. They're oftentimes conditioned, or they are conditioned by society and institutions in society like the family, the church, and the state, oftentimes condition this. So how does something like the church condition such a personality?
Well, before we talk about the church, I think we should talk about the family. So the authoritarian personality is born in the family with a strict authoritarian father and so on, who then produces these authoritarian children. So we have to see the family first, but it's not only in the family, but it's also in the church. The authoritarian pastor, and particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, we became very authoritarian. The more authoritarian, the more it was threatened by modernity, the more the Roman Catholic Church became authoritarian in order to defend itself against this, defend itself against modernity, which was rising and which was wrong according to the church.
Right. And then the state, in many ways, especially if it's captured by the authoritarian, provides these almost like a social model for the rest of society, for civil society, allows civil society that has, in many cases, repressed its authoritarian tendencies. It allows them to come to the foreground, to come up, to percolate up. And then oftentimes the state will use those authoritarian tendencies within civil society, in order to push forward its own goals.
Yes.
So it's almost like this perverse triad of family, civil society, of which the church is part, and then the state, all to produce a totalizing whole authoritarian social institution, an authoritarian country, if you will.
So I grew up in fascist Germany. So in 1933, when Hitler came into power, I was 6 years old. And so I then entered church movement. And so the authoritarian element was in the church and was in the state and was in the family. And we have to see here that we cannot simply say that authoritarian is bad. So when I say I had an authoritarian father, he was a very good father, but he had this authoritarian trait, and so did his father, who was a very authoritarian teacher. and they were, in a certain sense, I loved them, they loved me. So we must not simply identify good and bad with democratic and authoritarian. There can come times when obviously people are longing for this authoritarian because the democratic doesn't side doesn't work, or people are not satisfied with it, or they come with all kinds of perverse ideas, and so then they long for an authoritarian father figure, and so to rescue them from the turmoil, from the chaos, and so on. So that happened in Germany, and unfortunately, this is happening now too again. Unfortunately, I have to survive this twice, which I did not really ask for, but that is what happened. As a matter of fact, we came here in order to prevent this here, and all my activities, my teaching and lectures all over Europe and here were in the direction to prevent this, that this would not come about and that we would solve our problems in a different way. But history is more powerful.
Yeah, and it seems like that, with the turn of the century, with the rapid changes that the United States is going through, cultural changes, the diversification of the peoples, immigration, mass immigration, the technologicalization of everything. I mean, my generation, when I was born, we still remember our daily life not being determined by technology, but now this next generation, everything is technologically driven. Relationships are all mediated through technology. Now with the dawn of AI and robotics and the combination of AI and robotics, the second complete secularization of society. And then, of course, all of those things somehow come together to produce that toxic mess by which an authoritarian leader can take advantage of and come to the foreground. Someone like a Donald Trump who can read the audience and see what their grievances are, see what their anxieties are, where their angst belongs, and then can take advantage of that to forward his own vision of the country, which of course serves his own self-interest.
But
And
he
go ahead.
has he has defined somehow the authoritarian situation when he said, "When I go to Manhattan and I kill somebody, people will still follow me," and so on. So um, they he knows that he knows the authoritarian personality as far as the masses are concerned, and he is one himself. So that accounts for his success.
Hmm. Very much so. So here's a good question that's come up about in our discussions in the last 10 years or so about authoritarian leadership is the
Mm.
question of can there be left-wing ideologies that have authoritarian leaders?
Well, it certainly can happen, and it happened in Russia in terms of Stalin. Then we have red fascism. That can happen, yes. But then, of course, as soon as the side loses a democratic element, then it goes in the wrong direction. But in Russia, it had only a very small bourgeoisie, and it did not do the industrialization, and so the socialists had to do that and got sidetracked. They were more concerned then with the industrialization process than with the promotion of socialism.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you would always hear that something like, communist China or Fidel Castro in Cuba, that somehow these were left-wing ideologies that became authoritarian, especially because, whether it's Vietnam or Cuba or whatnot, any of these countries that went towards the left, the Golden Triangle in Latin America, that they never had a single day of normal development because they were always attacked. And when you're under attack from especially from the United States or other powerful entities, you somehow become more and more authoritarian because you become more defensive. Is that the case?
Exactly, yeah, I would say that is right. So if they did not have the external antagonism all the time and could develop more widely or so, they would probably not fall into the authoritarian trap and could be more democratic. So, but they are all these socialistic developments happened under pressure from other societies, particularly also from fascist societies.
Right. So, a core question I think about the authoritarian personality is, are they constitutionally necrophilic? In the sense of Eric Fromm's concept of necrophilia, the love of death, the fascination with death, or things that are dead, dead things, which seems to really be the essence of capitalism, which is, the private accumulation of collective surplus value. Of course, the collective surplus value in and of itself is a means to appropriate more dead things, things that are alive, stuff. And so is authoritarianism constitutionally necrophilic, or does it have a biophilic element in it?
Yeah, it is death friendly in a certain sense. So if we see how the Hitler regime ended up and all the suicides, everybody committed suicide, and Hitler and his wife and Goebbels and his wife and their 5 children, and there is an unbelievable death friendliness, of course, under horrible outside pressure. But nevertheless, there were other possibilities to react were there. But so, yes, there is a death friendliness as a psychological disposition, and then there's the real death which comes from it in a certain situation.
Yeah, in a recent discourse I had with someone, we were talking about the nature of, for instance, Trump obviously is the most prominent authoritarian we're dealing with in the US, and that it seems like his natural psychological disposition, being that he came from corporate capitalism, that he came from he has this marketing personality, that his form of necrophilia was always about money and the appropriation of money and the acquisition of money, on and on and on. And it wasn't the kind of necrophilia that you saw with like a death cult, or a cult of leadership that always emphasized sacrifice, as you had with the fascists. But now in the second term, with his 8 attacks, or his attacks on 8 different countries, and now this massive attack on Iran, people are rethinking this. Okay, what kind of necrophilia is this? Is this death of killing people a form of necrophilia that covers the other form of necrophilia, his enrichment of himself? So, I mean, is it theoretically possible that an authoritarian personality type can have both forms of necrophilia, the appropriation of dead things and that death friendliness of actually killing people?
Yeah, it is somewhat connected, but of course, um, yes, I think you're right. It's certainly connected. Yes.
Yeah. So we mentioned earlier about the family, and I brought up the issue of the churches and how religiosity or forms of religion can contribute to this personality, this authoritarian personality. Do we see that in contemporary America where the authoritarian church has a role, a strong role? Because as we have this increasingly secular society, the desacralized society and religious ways of being in the world are seemingly in decline, even in the United States. Do we still have a strong authoritarian church and religiosity that reproduces this type of psychological profile?
I think we had it up to Pope Francis, and his movement, which he initiated, and there it became more open. Quasi-democratic elements came up. The Pope seemed to not really democratic, but inclined to be open to democratic tendencies. And that was the first time since the early church. The early church was democratic before it became aristocratic, and before there were popes and bishops and archbishops and the whole hierarchy. So therefore, that is a very encouraging type of a movement which Francis developed, and he picked his successor. So his successor continues his tendencies, and we hope we will go on to do that in spite of great pressure. So yes, there are insights. The church has become aware of its authoritarian character, in spite of the fact that it can be explained. It does not represent adequately what the founder or Jesus had taught. Jesus was not an authoritarian. There are many religions which are founded by authoritarian characters, but Jesus was not an authoritarian character.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you what you're saying about the Catholic Church, especially with Pope Francis and now Pope Leo the 14th, that it's a new tone for, a rather authoritarian institution. Um, and it seems to be opening up to the world as Second Vatican Council was meant to do. Finally, now what's happening with Francis and Pope Leo the 14th. But of course, in and of itself, that change of tone has engendered quite the reaction from the very authoritarian side of the church, who is pushing back. I mean, to the point where right now in 2026, we're talking about another possible schism happening between those who are followers or the pietists of Pope Pius, one of the Pope Piuses. I can't remember off my head, but and so now, I mean, as you have more of a democratic personality, more democratic institution coming about, you're going to have that pushback. The dialectic is there to have the pushback against that. Is that correct?
Well, the Catholics in the United States, particularly, are afraid that things will fall apart. So the authoritarian personality seems to be able to hold things together better. And as the church becomes democratic, there is the fear that the whole thing will disintegrate. That means the church becomes Protestant, and that is the danger which certain very Orthodox Catholics are afraid of. But there one has to be trusting of the Holy Spirit a little bit too, that that one does not need the authoritarian personality exactly to hold it together, but that there are other forces which hold it together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely one of the most profound fears, I think, within the church is that it becomes Protestant. So to become Protestant means to, compromise with modernity, become a little bit more democratic. And we can see right now what's happening, at least in the US, where the mainstream Protestant denominations are dying in many ways. And the two forms of Christianity that have been prevalent in the US that are growing are the Catholics and the Catholic Church that still seems to, like we said, changing its tone with the latest two popes, and the evangelicals, which are increasingly becoming more and more authoritarian. So you see that split between the two. And then the oldest of the non-Protestant denominations, the Orthodox tradition, that has become a hotbed, at least in the West. It's become a home for some of the most authoritarian personalities because they see it as a bastion of tradition, and the tradition does not compromise with modernity and therefore holds it all together, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, modernity is a Western affair and not the Eastern affair. So the Eastern churches were not confronted and challenged by modernity like Western Catholicism did. So, yes, I mean, there are new developments at least in Roman Catholicism, particularly in Germany and so on, where the church begins to become aware I think Rome is aware, but Francis was aware of the danger of the authoritarian personality and warned against it too, very often.
Yeah, he oftentimes said that the church should be a field hospital,
Yeah,
open to the world, right? Open to anyone who is in need. And that's a very different way of being in the world from those who say, we have this rigid orthodoxy. If you're not part of, our club, then you're outside of us and we have nothing to do with you. And he tries to open up to the world. And I think Leo the 14th is of course, like you said, is in continuing this type of trajectory within the church.
yeah. I mean, this horrible thing that hundreds of army chaplains went with the process of Barbarossa into Russia and killed 26 million Russians and 6 million Jews. And here the authoritarian personality became just outrageous. And the church has not reflected on this yet. John the 23rd was aware of it and called the council even in order to bring about the corrections. So the in this sense, the church has not yet done that memory work. Um, they forget that they had a treaty with Mussolini and that they had a treaty with Hitler. And then, of course, after those other pagan movements showed their paganism, then the church, of course, became aware of it and fought them and so on. But for a long time, the church went along with these fascist movements and made them attractive and so were responsible that they could grow. Hitler was a Catholic after all. Mussolini was a Catholic. They are all both ex-Catholics, their wives too, and so on. So, yeah, there is something in Catholicism which supported these fascist movements in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, and in all the Catholic countries. Unfortunately, so then the church has to become aware of it and has become aware of it, at least Francis has, and his follower has. So if that leads now to consequences, to a change that the leadership becomes more democratic, I think there is the fear of communism, particularly. The reason why the church sided with fascism was that it would um, it needed defense against the socialism and communism and so on. So even if a pastor of mine, even in the last weeks of the war, and he had suffered from fascism, but then he would say there's only one who can rescue us from communism, and that is Hitler. And he had suffered by the Hitler movement for 12 years, but still thought that Hitler was the only one who could rescue the church from communism. So the fear of communism drove the church into the arms of fascism.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. I mean, it seems like you were talking about Operation Barbarossa with um, the pastors that went with the soldiers to bless the whole thing. We have very much the same issue again today. So those who are watching this video, we're right now, as we're recording this, in the midst of the U.S. and Israel's war on Iran. Um, and Mikey Weinstein, who runs the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, who back in the early 2000s had to sue the Air Force Academy because of the rampant proselytization, evangelical proselytization that was happening within the Air Force Academy. He's now once again fielding lots of complaints from active duty soldiers, sailors, and Marines because their commanders are talking about this war against Iran as a war that is blessed by God. It's there to bring about Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus of Nazareth, and that Trump himself was ordained by Jesus in order to bring about this Armageddon. And so we're watching once again this almost like this how should one say the actualization of Constantinian Christianity, that
Exactly.
somehow the state and the church is coming back together to work against the world, everything that is outside of the us and the them dialectic. All the others have to be confronted.
So, and I was a leader in the Catholic youth movement, and we had that hope that this Constantinian Christianity had come to its end with the Second World War and so on. But we were disappointed. It did not come to an end. It continued. But in this continued, there was then Francis, and there is his successor. So there are forces struggling with each other. The democratic and the authoritarian character in the church struggle with each other.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Jesus of Nazareth was an authoritarian, and I think when we read the red letters in the Gospels and whatnot, you see he really has this very democratic revolutionary personality. I mean, he's not a Lenin or a Marx or whatnot, but it's that revolutionary impulse is there by all means. And sometimes it's expressed in very earthly language, and other times it's expressed in eschatological language, but the revolutionary is there. But somehow this revolutionary nature of Jesus gets co-opted and it becomes an authoritarian in this Constantinian Christianity. And so that form of Christianity becomes deeply attractive to authoritarian personalities that still operate within a religious idiom.
Yeah, well, he did not return. And so the church developed, and this church had a constitution, and it imitated the outside constitutions of kings um, and monarchies and so on, and aristocracies. And um, so that is a strange inheritance, and the church has to deal with this now. As one doesn't know what will happen, but if the democratic tradition continues, then the church has to think more democratically, of course, as it goes on. And
Yeah.
we have here Hegel there on our picture in the background. And if we had not banned him here in the United States, but had learned from him, I think we could understand history a little bit better.
Yeah, you always said in your lectures that if Hitler had been reading Hegel
Yeah,
and not Schopenhauer, then he would have known that his project, his palingenetic political project of the Third Reich, the time had passed.
yeah, right. But he followed Schopenhauer, so he is the philosopher of pessimism, of Occidental pessimism, and uh, there's this deep pessimism in the authoritarian in Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer had other followers too, like Horkheimer and Adorno were also following Schopenhauer, so one did not necessarily have to draw the conclusions which Hitler and Goebbels and these people drew from him. So, but Hitler had the volumes of Schopenhauer with him in the First World War. And whenever he had some time between the battles and so on, he would read Schopenhauer. So the picture which we have of Hitler in this country, the propaganda picture, does not at all present him, and that is dangerous. He was much more than we saw here in the United States. So um, I mean, which of our politicians read Schopenhauer or plays wonderful piano and all this? We don't have politicians like this. So, and therefore we have not understood him from the beginning. And he himself was a lover of America. It was his longing. Henry Ford. He thought he was the great man in politics, and Henry Ford was the great man in economics. And Ford went to Berlin and got a lot of decorations from Hitler. So that was 100 years ago when we had Lindbergh here and Father Coughlin, and here also even he was even pastor here in Kalamazoo. So we had that all in the 20s and the 30s, and then Roosevelt undid it, and the war, of course. But in the underground, they continued, and they have been awakened and have come to the surface among us.
Yeah, speaking of Hitler and other authoritarians, historical authoritarians, right on up to today with our current ones, it always seems that there's a necessity to have the other, the necessity to have this outside target that you can direct all the antagonistic ire against or all the negative energy and somehow why is it that it's the authoritarian personality that needs the other, the Jews, in the Third Reich, for instance, and here right now in the United States, it's immigrants, for instance. Why is that always a necessity for the authoritarian personality to have that other?
Well, it's the fear of replacement. Um, they fear that in Germany or so, they are replaced by other tribes, by other social units, and so on. So this fear of replacement makes them so aggressive against the others who may replace them. So that is the case in Europe, and it's the case here too. Those white supremacists there, they see all the other races coming up, and they are frightened, and so they say, "This is our America," and now they make their America. Um, so that is the situation in which we are. And I think all these things have to be taken seriously wherever all this happens. These are human beings, after all. We must not let ourselves to hate some people or whatever. We rather should try to understand what is behind them and why they act in this strange way, and why they are so hostile to other characters. And so, well, that is what we do here, of course, in our talks, but it is that's not what's going on outside.
Yeah, it seems like right now with the attack on immigrants to the United States, whether those immigrants are legal documented immigrants, green card holders, or they're here without documents because they came across the border or they just overstayed their visa, whatever it is, it always seems like there's a bit of spectacle to this whole thing, that it's political spectacle that, whether they're here or not really isn't that important to, at least to this particular administration, the Trump administration 2.0, but it sends a message to his followers. It's almost like this implicit white nationalist message that I am your savior of you, the true Americans, which we all know wink, wink, nod, nod means people who look like me and you, right? That we're the true Americans. And the rest of them might be citizens, they might be green card holders, but they're not really Americans. Um, and I separate that as almost like a strategy from those like Hitler, who truly thought, perversely or not, that the Jews were a threat to the Aryans, a threat to the Germans and whatnot. So the difference between a spectacle, not that Trump's not racist, of course, he has a long history of racism, right? But he's willing to make all kinds of exemptions, But whereas Hitler, well, even he had an exemption with the doctor, but nevertheless, it seemed like a true believer in the hatred of the other.
Yeah. Well, so when we say, so what do you want then? What kind of immigrants do you want then? And they say, of course, Scandinavia. It is Sweden and Norway. All people, they have no difficulty to come in, including the Germans. I mean, Trump is a German. He comes from Bavaria. His grandfather had a wife from Bavaria. there's a big history between Bavaria and the Trumps and so on. So they're Germans. I mean, Bavaria is also that where, of course, National Socialism was born. Um, so there is something to this territory we don't have to go into, but um, certainly so uh, we have a certain heritage there, and that goes to Northern Europe. And so if we would ask him, what do you want? They would say, well, we want to have all these people from Sweden and Norway and Denmark and from Germany and what the West? Well, the West as, as a subdued type of a mass would be okay, would do the work or whatever. But it is the question who rules, the question who is on top of the whole thing. And they have the feeling that their top position could be threatened. There is a black president. This is something horrifying, of course, for these Germanic tribesmen. And they show it, of course, every day.
Yeah. The interesting thing is it's ironic that right now, just this morning, I was reading an article about how Americans are leaving the United States in record numbers right now. They're immigrating, and especially to back to Europe. So a lot of people are going back to Europe. Americans are giving up on America because of this type of, politics that these white nationalist politics that you would have with Donald Trump, what authoritarian politics. And so he's having the opposite effect on the United States that he would certainly wish to have if he wants more Scandinavians. I mean, who in Scandinavia really wants to emigrate to the United States right now?
Yeah, right. So, but told people already in the 70s when we had problems like this, not to leave the country. What happens if all the good people leave the country? It doesn't get better, certainly. So I always counseled my students, and then and now, not to leave the country, but to stand up for what was good in this country and beautiful, and that we hold on to this and that it will not be buried. Yes, there is a danger now, but exactly because of this danger, we should stay here and should hold on to that what was good and great and beautiful in this country.
Yeah, constitutional patriotism counts the most when the Constitution and patriotism is either under threat or being co-opted.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, that's something that I try to emphasize as well is the dialectics of America in the history and the heritage. Of course, American history is full of some of the most brutal, ugly crimes that you could possibly think of, and genocide and slavery and internment camps. And I mean, all the ugliness is here. All the ugliness has been done by the U.S. But it's also a society that's created some of the most beautiful things, some of the greatest art forms in artists and in the our education system, even though it's constantly under attack and undermined, has produced some of the greatest minds and on and on and on. And at its heart, it is about some kind of liberal understanding of what freedom, justice, and democracy ought to be, even if it's never really realized it in its totality, in its finality. But that type of dialectical understanding of what America is, that it's a cause for goodness and a cause for criminality at the same time. I think that gets lost when we condemn it all as bad, as so often, people generally more on the left would do, or we praise it as being everything is good, God's gift to the world, as people oftentimes on the right do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And then um, wherever we join some group, probably there are some criminal elements there somewhere in the beginning. States are very often founded on very criminal basis. So we have to recognize this and not push it, not repress it, but say, okay, we have those bad things. So do the Germans, so do the French, so do the Spaniards. We all have that in common. That's our original sin. So is Israel. So is every state which comes about. has this original sin of doing some horrible stuff to other people in order to found themselves. Heaven knows how far that goes back. So, uh, so one has to be honest about that. Yes, there have been terrible things. Yes, what happened to the native people and so on, and what happened to the slaves, and these were all horrible things. But we can say this, and then we say also the good things which are there. So we have to take it both and be honest about it and teach our children about that. Not only one side, it was all bad or it was all good, but it was a mixture of both of them. And we have to live with this in the church too. If I'm a member of the Roman Church, as I am, then of course I know about the Inquisition. I know about the horrible things which happened among the popes and so on, what a miserable history that is, and so on. So when I stay in this church, nevertheless, then because there are also some good things in it which are worthwhile to stay with it.
Yeah, it's a definitely a lover's quarrel, as they would say, with the United States.
Yeah,
But patriotism, I mean, that's the nature of patriotism. Nationalism, my country, right or wrong, love it or leave it, as you always said. Where patriotism is much more complex. It's, pride, but that pride is often tempered by the realization that you're a part of a project that also has a ugly history, criminal history. And so one can't simply just ignore the whole thing, the criminal history. It is constitutionally part of what this country is. And just like the authoritarian and the democratic personalities, right? I mean, America, in my analysis, if we have Geist, if we have a spirit, which I think we do, it was always a divided spirit, one divided against itself constantly and ongoing. And you can see every time as one side of that spirit is ascendant, and like you're talking about having a black man, symbolic victory for America, despite his policies, whether they were good or bad. I never underestimate the power of that symbolic victory of having a black man. But that's an ascendant side of one part of this divided spirit of America. And then that other side pushes back harshly. And that's the dialectic of American history, and that's the dialectic of history.
yeah. So what are we doing then? We are standing with those who bring something good, something positive, and so on. This black president did that. He did that exactly. He brought us back to ourselves. The values which he had are not African values, they are American values. And so he tells us what our own values are and reminds us of it. That is very, very important.
Absolutely. And then we remind him when he failed to uphold those values. But that's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He does it in a way which is positive, which is loving, which is not hateful. And so he tells us who we were and who we should be.
Right. Right. Exactly. And of course, that the authoritarian personality does not want to hear what they ought to be. Not at all. So,
Yeah, we are in a deep crisis of our nation. We did have other crises before, and we will make it. But we can make it only if we do not run away.
right. Yes.
Do not run away and surrender, then we also become guilty of the whole thing. So therefore, we have to stay.
We have to stay on the side of justice, right? Stay on the side of love and compassion and mercy, but also with a resolute, strong, stiff back, you know.
Yeah.
So
It will not be easy, but the nation will survive.
it will. Yeah, and at the same time, we also have to constantly remember the victims of the nation. And like I said, we're in the midst of another war that is creating victims after victims after victims. And the only weak messianism we have, as Walter Benjamin would say, is that memory. right? Is to remember and to remember and to talk about and to bring them up, the victims of this violence.
Yeah. And we have to counteract this necrophilia
Mm.
um, of the president and all those who follow him. This necrophilia means that they are not sensitive enough to death and the horror of death, not only for our own people's death, but also other people's death in other countries and so on. The president is too leger, too flapsy about the death of other people, and that means he is necrophilous.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how, I mean, my own personal, my own personal psychology, I don't know how one could possibly look at this little girls' school in southern Iran that was bombed by the United States and over 100 little girls killed just with their little backpacks going to learn poetry and math and history and just vaporized. And then very next day, the president is in the White House talking about the drapes on the wall and how wonderful these drapes are and the color. And, I picked them out. And that is, the most extreme form of necrophilia to be able to mass kill and then talk about drapes the next day as if nothing happened. But that, of course, is, that is conditioned by psychopathy, the psychopath aspect of his personality, and also the authoritarian personality, which is almost always psychopathic.
Yeah, yeah, that he takes death not seriously, and because does not take life seriously.
Yeah, very
He
much so.
he is still in there, and he is responsible for whatever he is doing, like everybody is, like we are.
Absolutely. So hopefully the innocent victim will at one point in time have their day in court. If not in this life, then we hope in the next life, right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
okay, well, Dr. Siebert, it's been a wonderful discourse about the authoritarian and democratic character and personality type, and clearly this is a concept that is very relevant for us right now, as it has been since its development with Eric Fromm and the Frankfurt School, and certainly one that deserves a whole lot of study on. And if I remember correctly, you're working on a book on this.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So we look
Most
forward.
most difficult book I ever wrote.
Most difficult, right? And to be writing that book at this time period, I think it's very poignant.
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you so much for doing another lecture for us and discourse for us.
You're welcome.
All right. And for those of you who are listening to this, check out other videos on the Rudolf J. Siebert Audiovisual Archive on YouTube. As we said before, we've got over 100 videos stretching back to the 1980s. I've got a lot of other audio tapes that I eventually am going to get put up of when I was a student and as an undergrad and as a master's student and then later as a PhD student that I recorded with Rudy. And eventually those will all be up there too. So you can take his classes on the psychological elements of religion, on Eric Fromm, on the new developments in the Frankfurt School, and all kinds of different stuff. So we're going to get those all up at some point.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.